Genshin Impact's roster is large and expansive, and given the high amount of characters, especially 5 stars, and the expensive cost of each of them, I want to evaluate what it truly means for a character to fall off meta or to just fall off in general. Whether this means the individuals who made them previously no longer do, or the amount of damage they deal is so low in comparison to more recent units that they just aren't worth building, using, or even pulling. If you happen to find yourself enjoying this later on, consider subscribing, as it would help out the channel, and maybe head into the Discord server down below. With all of that being said, we're going to start off with the original roster of units because I do think they're incredibly important to reference just as a baseline starting point. This being Diluc, Mona, Jean, Qiqi, and Keqing. If we're looking at each individual from a perspective of how much damage can they deal, Diluc is the highest in terms of what he had access to when the game first released. Now, Keqing arguably has the best setup for that. But I do think it's incredibly important to consider what they each brought to the table. Jean and Qiqi brought unparalleled healing, with Jean having a burst heal and Qiqi having an off-field healing that could apply to any character so long as they did normal attacks. Mona was not only an off-field Hydra applier, but also great at buffing her damage. She was the damage per screenshot character a lot of people used. And whilst newer characters such as Tignari and Dea have been added to the standard banner, and we have expanded what they are capable of as a result, I think it's important to set these as the solid baseline. Realistically, because you're supposed to lose your 50-50 to these individuals and they aren't supposed to be considered that good of a thing, every subsequent unit that comes after them should be higher in value and in terms of their respective niches than these units themselves. Don't get me wrong, I don't think they should be god-awful, but I do want to seriously look at what made them so great and what makes them so bad nowadays. At the start of the game, Diluc didn't have any individuals to realistically contend with other than characters like Razor. And whilst you have Beidou, she's much more geared as an off-field support like she is now. He was dethroned when dedicated damage dealers were released with Ganyu, Hu Tao, or Xiao. Klee was a character who could theoretically at least do more damage, but let's be honest here, a lot of individuals did not like her playstyle, and Catalyst users took a very long time to get into a fluid playstyle, so I won't be considering her. And Child is much more of an enabler than he is a just standalone damage dealer. With this being said, did Diluc fall off? Yes, but the reason for it is because when he was released, he wasn't realistically that good. He was a strong unit in comparison to what we had back then, but he had no real 5-star competition, at least as a damage dealer. What about the others? Well, none of them have realistically fallen out of place. Jean is still an amazing healer, and arguably if you're losing your 50-50, it's kind of one of the best options you have. Whether it's Viridescent Venerer or her having the entirety of your party burst healed immediately, she is extremely good at her job. Even Qiqi, despite a lot of people not liking her, does do healing extremely well. I built her, she does it enough. I don't particularly use Mona, but I do know she is still good as a damage buffer. And so overall, that baseline of units is still decent enough. But don't get me wrong, we've had some flops here and there. I don't think Dea is the best, at least where she stands, and she does not live up to the expectations or at least the baseline value set by other characters. However, if we expand our roster outside of these standard banner characters and go towards the limited ones, the ones who've fallen out the meta are much more of the niche characters, or the ones that are very restrictive. It's not an unpopular opinion to say that Eula or Itto are more restrictive units and as a result are less commonly used. The same can be said for somebody like Sino or Ayato. Because of the nature of each of these characters being that everybody falls into a very specific niche, you either have a damage dealer on your team or an off-field damage support, and when it's neither one of those two, it's either going to be a protective defensive unit like Zhongli or a healer. The times individuals stray out of that or require too much investment to really get value out of, such as Itto, who requires Albedo, Zhongli, and others, you run into a situation where if the unit is balanced around other characters, specifically other 5-stars, that unit's value is entirely based on how strong everybody else in their team is. Eula and Arataki Itto are both decent units, but the problem is with Itto, he requires dedicated supports that are all limited in their niche. Albedo and Zhongli can perform arguably better in other teams, with Zhongli especially being valued in many other compositions. This means that Itto himself needs to offer enough value for your teams to be worthwhile to use, especially considering he's stealing your Albedo, your Goro, and your Zhongli from other potential teams. And at that point, the baseline investment required to reach that point isn't worth it. However, that's not necessarily the only reason why a unit falls off. Another could be, in Hu Tao's case, when other reactions can overshadow them. Hu Tao and characters like Ganyu were extremely good for a long period of time. But due to the release of Dendro and the extremely high skilling of those reactions, we've seen these characters drop down in terms of pull value. This is not because of their own damage dropping, but instead because other options arguably require less investment or less effort to pull off. Don't get me wrong, teams like Hyperbloom and Bloom in general do require certain units of certain archetypes, this being Hydro, a Electro if you really choose to use Hyperbloom, and a Dendro, and as of right now we don't have many Dendro units. However, as a result of this, we've seen units who can in some way, shape, or form benefit these reactions be pushed pushed even further up the meta. Raiden Shogun is a unit who was already good on her own in rational teams, already good with hyper carry teams, and had good constellations, and now she has access to Hyper Bloom. This means that even if you didn't like the character as an on-field DPS, she is still valuable in other niches. And as a result of this, we've seen other characters like Zhongli who offer defensive utility for the blooms that can deal damage to you as well, and lowers the resistance of all elements. Units like Kokomi or Nahida have been pushed up even further due to the reaction themselves, and as a result it can make other units who require either more investment or more setup required feel and be worse overall. I don't think it's fair to say a unit falls off because they're just bad. I don't think outside of Dea right now, we have any absolutely god-awful characters. Damage is important, but ultimately I do think it's important to state whether or not you actually enjoy a character. Don't get me wrong, you could have units like Aika who deal a ton of damage, but if a unit like Aika isn't someone you like playing, then it doesn't really matter how much damage she deals. I personally don't like Nahida or Ahytham, so for me, Dendro's been kind of a dead element, but I have other units who I do enjoy that can make up for that difference. Further solidifying my point, if you main Diluc or Klee or some other off-meta character, maybe you're a Zhao main, then sure, you will have a harder time clearing Abyss or even accessing difficult content. But that's not saying it's impossible to clear. We've seen individuals do it with Dea, and yes, there are buffers that can really help you out in that situation. I don't think it's fair to say a unit has fallen out of meta because I think that gives a wrong perception. I think instead it's better off to say that there are other options now. You can use Diluc, there are other options. Has Diluc fallen off? It depends. From a sheer damage perspective, yes, there are other units out there, but let me be clear, a lot of individuals, actually no individual as of right now, can summon for Diluc intentionally. You can't guarantee him because there is no limited banner. If a unit like Aika comes around, we always talk about how good a unit is, but not necessarily the restrictions that they have. Aika is to a degree locked into freeze or very stationary enemies, and if you don't have the units that can properly support her in that endeavor, then you're kind of stuck with a character who situationally can be really good. Overall, units don't fall out of the meta. Sure, they become less valuable compared to others, but it doesn't mean they're bad or any worse than they previously were. Hu Tao will always deal the same amount of damage Hu Tao always has. Eula is always going to be Eula. She's always going to deal the same amount of damage she has. Nobody gets worse over time. They just look worse by comparison to other units, and other units themselves such as Alhaitham may be really good, but the question is, how much investment are you willing to put into that team? If we're comparing that, Alhaitham, Yai, Kuki, and Nahida is 3 5-star units, and if you're looking at it from that situation, that is more investment than would be required for somebody like a Diluc Melt or Vape team. So when it comes to looking at units as a whole, and if you're just basing it off a spectrum, sure, there are other characters who may deal more damage. However, damage isn't the only metric to judge a character by. I don't think any unit as of right now has fallen out of meta. I think there are units who are worse in comparison to others, at least from a damage perspective, but subsequently, I think there are also valuable trade-offs for characters. An example being Hu Tao and her HP draining. You don't want to run over the Bennett. Well, now you need to worry about survivability a bit more. Yelan having no defensive utility compared to Xingqiu. That is a difference and something you actively need to consider. Overall, it's a nuanced discussion, and I do legitimately think it's important to have, because if we're just basing every unit off damage, then we get nowhere. But what about you? What are your opinions? Do you main a unit that's maybe not super good anymore, or do you just play who you want? And if you do, that's perfectly fine. I just think it's important to consider where opinions are coming from as a whole. I'm speaking as a Yoimiya main, as somebody who got Yai Miko, and as somebody who does not use Dendro. So yes, I am an individual who does dumb things sometimes. But that's going to be it for me, at least for this video. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.